tātou and welcome to Beyond the Bubble, a series of moderated conversations about topics that can cause a degree of division in our communities. And so this is a chance for us to talk across the gaps that might occur in those conversations in a respectful way. Today's kaupapa is poverty, in particular with a view to child poverty. In view of the Labour-led coalition's recent decisions to focus on poverty and a commitment to dealing with it, do we still need to care now that the government has said that it will fix the problem? So it's my pleasure to introduce our panel today. We are fortunate to be joined by David Hanna, Director of Wesley Community Action and part of Inspiring Communities, which sees him running a wide range of social services and community development activities across the wider Wellington region. Kia ora. We are also joined today by Donna Provoost, economist and director of the Strategy, Rights and Advice team at the Office of the Children's Commissioner. And we're fortunate to be joined by Dr Bryce Wilkinson, Senior Fellow of the New Zealand Initiative and the Director of the Wellington-based economic consultancy firm Capital Economics. Nau mai haramai kia koutou katoa. So to start us off by looking at perhaps what we agree on before we look to how we might do things differently, I think we can probably agree that poverty in all its forms is a phenomenon that causes misery throughout generations and need not happen, or at least things can change for the better. But I was going to ask you, Bryce, do you think there's some degree of common agreement as to what some of those root causes of poverty might be in order for us to grapple with it?
Yes, I think there's large and widespread agreement about that. There's a lot of research on it. It's been well documented. There are a whole bunch of compounding factors overlapping, but they're different for different individuals in different cases, and they're different across the regions in their intensity and in the way they manifest themselves. So yes, I think it's common ground that we've got a major problem in New Zealand. The situation we're seeing is really unacceptable, and much better solutions have to be found.
Would either of you care to pick out what you might consider to be one or two of the root causes that most urgently need to be addressed?
I think there are some systemic factors that need to be addressed in what is happening for many families in communities across the country, that it's not just about some families in certain communities or having problems. There's over 220 to 290, depending how you want to measure it, children living in families that are in low incomes. And that's beyond individual issues about choice of to work or not, or to get a job. And in fact, more than half of the children in households have paid employment. So the systemic factors that are keeping those families in the chaotic situations and in poverty now are things that we think need to be addressed.
I think language is very important and when talking about poverty, and there's multiple views on that. So my experience of working alongside families who I would define as experiencing poverty, that's not language they use. They will tend to be proud about their community and where they're at. Whereas the three of us on the panel, we're probably not we're not experiencing poverty and that. So we have a different frame or angle to look at it, and so I think that is quite important, particularly when you're talking about solutions to poverty, because people have their own mana and integrity, and you want to enhance that and develop that. And sometimes, if we keep focusing on their negativity and what's not happening, it can be counterproductive. Well, at the same time, as we're in agreement, there's a consistent set of really poor outcomes and compounding trauma that poverty certainly sort of feeds.
And of course, when it comes to labelling a particular group of people, what we're also seeing with the introduction of the child poverty bill before Parliament at the moment is the introduction of poverty measures and ways of categorising people's lived experience. Bryce, what do you think of the measurements that are being suggested in this bill?
There's a lot of them, and it begs the question of what the priorities are. There's a lot of emphasis on relative income as a measure. but we know that that's not a good measure of sort of deprivation or misery. And so I've got a personal preference for measures which would focus more on the material hardship or deprivation as it somewhat, because that's not being able to afford to take your kids to the doctor or something when they needed to. Well, that's real and tangible, and I think most people would relate to that.
Would you agree, David, that even though we face that problem of then identifying and labelling people in a particular way, that actually we need these tools of measurement?
I think measurement is really important. A few observations. One is, we have a whole lot of data, and there's sort of a lot of proxies that already give us some good data, like the prison population. If we want to grow poverty in New Zealand, then grow the prison population. It's pretty simple. Prison population, educational outcomes. I think Treasury released a report just a week or so ago about the number of young people that are moving between schools, multiply moving between schools. And I think that's a really important. So there's lots of data out there. So I think you could grab any cross-section across health, education, justice, and they'll be good enough, because you're never going to get the perfect measures. The thing that frustrates me about the process of measuring, and this was particularly strong under the previous government and the social investment approach, is that all this data was sucked up, and then a whole lot of people in Wellington, bright people in Wellington, would sit in their offices and analyse the data and make sense of that data. Now, our experience is that it's really important in making sense of the data that the people who it is their data, their story, they're the ones that need to interact with it. It's their lives. So if we want people to create pathways out of poverty, they need to be looking at their story and their data and making sense of it. Because it's the making sense of measures which is really the sweet spot about why we have targets.
What does that look like?
Well, on the ground, in the communities we work with, it's actually in the process of working with them being really clear about they have an active voice in what's working for them or not. So maybe if they've got a social worker working with them, if after a period of time they're not really valuing that social worker or not really hitting it off, they should have the ability to give that feedback, and we should be able to pause and say, well, okay, maybe we should try someone else. So at every way we operate, we need to ensure that their view, we talk about their theory of change, needs to be actually driving the process. But so often, the system, it's the theory of change of government agencies actually drives the system. I think there's a number of strands to it, but certainly there's one where the people experiencing the issue, their voice is privileged in actually shaping what happens. And I don't think we will create a pathway out of poverty until we do that.
So, Donna, do you see any kind of contradiction there or tension there?
I would say the issue of having the data, keeping an eye on the overarching data and measures, it's still really important. I 100% agree with David around the issue about community, but that's part of it. There is still a role about looking at, are your universal services for health, education, and social services actually working or not? How do we know if they're working? Those things that looking at the trends across poverty and hardship will give you an indication. But sitting alongside of that, things like your health measures and your indications about hospitalizations for chest infections, things like that, are really great indicators that show you immediately, because there's all a lag in all these other measures. But we know right away when there's trends in the health system about more admissions or not. And that, in many ways, is your best indicator of what's happening in poverty.
Kia ora. We're just going to leave it there for a moment. We'll be back shortly with our discussion.